Color grading in filmmaking plays a big role in setting the atmosphere of a scene. Every film you've ever watched uses color grading to portray some type of emotion. But what really is color grading? Well, color grading is a post-production editing process. It involves manipulating the color of footage to achieve a certain emotion, mood, or tone. Now, before we get into actually manipulating color, I want to go over some color theory. Now, you might have heard of color theory before, but what is it and how does it apply to filmmaking? Well, for many years, artists have found ways to classify colors and apply certain meanings to them. You may have seen a popular way of classifying color known as a color wheel. It's a chart which illustrates the relationship between colors. In a color wheel, colors which are complementary are opposite of each other. It's important to know this because it allows us to know which colors work together and which don't. Keep the color wheel in mind while you watch this tutorial, because we'll end up using it later to help us color grade footage. So before we move on, I want to go over another idea in color theory known as color temperature. The color temperature of footage is a value which tells us if the footage is warm or cold. In terms of color psychology, using cold colors makes the mood of the scene sad and emotional, whereas warm colors would do the opposite. It's imperative for us as editors and colorists to know when to use warm or cold colors, and how they change the feeling of the scene. If you're interested in knowing which value of white balance you should set your camera to, search for color temperature chart in Google, and you can set your camera accordingly. So, how do we manipulate color in film? The answer to that question is really quite broad, as there are many different techniques for manipulating color. Most editing softwares out there now have some form of color grading capability built into them, but for the purpose of this tutorial, we'll be using a powerful tool known as DaVinci Resolve, a free, professional-level color grading tool created by Blackmagic. The link to download this software is available for download in the description, as is all the footage that we color grade. After downloading DaVinci, installing it should be pretty simple. All you have to do is double-click the installer and follow the instructions and you should be good to go. Once you create a new project, you should see a fresh screen like what I have. It looks a little daunting at first, but it becomes simple very quickly. The first thing I want to bring your attention to are the 4 tabs at the bottom of the screen, which are Assemble, Edit, Color, and Deliver. These 4 tabs each have a purpose, and you want to work through them from left to right. The first panel is the Assemble panel. It's where you first start when you open the program, and it's where you bring your clips in from your computer into the media pool. The Edit panel is where you grab your clips from the media pool and edit them into a structure, sort of like a stream. This is similar to what you do in something like Final Cut or Premiere Pro. The Color tab is the interesting tab, and it's where you do all of your coloring work. It's basically the core of DaVinci Resolve. The important parts of this panel that I want you to focus on during this tutorial are the Preview, the Node Editor, and the Adjustments tab down the bottom. There are more tabs which you can get used to and learn as you go along, but for the purpose of this tutorial, we're going to be sticking to those 3. I want to focus quickly on the Node Editor. It's probably the most challenging part of DaVinci, and it can get really complex really quick. Everything in DaVinci is built up from these nodes. You can add a new node by right-clicking and selecting New Node in the Node Editor. You can also do this by pressing Alt-S. But what really are nodes? I guess you can think of nodes as filters. You pass footage through the color adjustment filters, and it outputs the result. It's a bit confusing when I say it like that, but you'll get used to it once we start to use them. I'm going to take you away from DaVinci just for a little bit so we can go over some terms that you might see in the software. I still want you to keep in mind what I said about nodes, and how nodes are basically filters that you put your footage through until you get your final product. If you're looking to do more complex color grading in the future, I'd suggest researching some more complex nodes. Now that you have a pretty good understanding of how DaVinci works, and how color theory can be applied to filmmaking, we're going to start to develop some habits and techniques which you can use to color grade some proper footage. I've included 2 pieces of footage in the description below which we're going to be using to color grade. We're going to try to correct the colors and we're going to try to style it in the way that we want. Here's a before and after of what we're going to try and achieve with this footage. Once you get into DaVinci, the first thing you want to do is create a new project and import the footage which I got you to download. You then want to drag that footage into the media pool, go to the edit tab and put it into a basic stream in the timeline. Once you get to the color tab, we can basically start our color grading. The first step in this workflow to achieve realistic color grading is to color correct. Color correcting is bringing the footage from its initial position to a position that looks realistic in the real world. To do this, the first three elements that you look at are the white balance, the contrast, and the skin tones in the footage. To help us do our color correcting, we're going to be using a feature in DaVinci known as scopes. Now, scopes basically gives us a reading of the image, and there are four main scopes in DaVinci that you're going to get used to. You've got the waveform, the parade, the histogram, and the vector scope. All four scopes have a purpose in color correction, and we're going to be using three of them to help us color correct. The first step in my workflow is to first balance the whites of the footage. I find that this is the best way to do it because it sort of naturalizes your footage so you can continue on and color correct it from there. To do this, we're going to be using a scope known as the parade scope. And to show the scopes in DaVinci, all you have to do is go to the preview tab, right click and press show scopes. Another way to access it is to go to the bottom right hand corner of your screen where it says keyframes and change it to scopes. I personally like to do the right clicking method better because you get a bigger scope and it allows you to see it a little bit better. You can switch between the scopes really easily just by clicking this little tab, and you can switch between all four of the scopes which I mentioned earlier. To white balance, we're going to be using the parade scope. You can also do this with the histogram scope, but I find that the parade gives a better visual representation of our footage. Now, you're probably wondering, what is a parade scope and how can it help us achieve white balance? Well, a parade scope gives us the readings of the red, blue, and green values of our footage. Now, to get white, what you want is you want to match the red, the green, and the blue at the same sort of level. Once these values are level, you get white. So, in order to achieve white balance, we want to get these scopes pretty much looking the same. So, the first step that we're going to do is we're going to create a new node by pressing Alt-S. We're going to right-click this node and press Change Label. I'm going to type in white balance just so I know what this node does in the future if I need to come back to it and edit it later. Once you've done this, we're going to go to the bottom left corner to the color wheels, and instead of color wheels, we're going to be going to the bars. These bars give you a reading of the red, the green, and the blue outputs. Now, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be changing these values so that the scopes match up and we get pure white. So if you're looking at the scopes, you'll probably notice that the red scope is looking a lot higher than the green and the blue. So to match these together, what we want to do is we want to take out some of the red from the footage. So to do this, you want to go to your bars, go to the red output, hover over the red with your mouse, and just scroll down. That just effectively takes away the red from the footage. If you were to scroll up, you'd add more red into the footage, but all that would do is overcolor our shot, and we're looking to get white. So, if you move the reds down, you can already start to see that the scopes start to level downward. You're going to want to do the same thing for blue and green until you get a sort of level look. If you then look at the footage, you'll see how much whiter and realistic it looks to the real world. You can toggle the nodes on and off to see this difference. Now that we've done our white balancing, we can move on to contrasting. To do contrasting, we're going to create a new node and change the label. If you can't change the label for some odd reason, all you have to do is increase the size of the image with that little slider, and then you should be able to do it. We're going to label this one contrast. Now, we're done with the parade scope. That was just to do our white balancing. We're going to move on to the waveform scope, which is this visual representation of the highlights and shadows in our image. The top of the waveform up here is absolute white, and the bottom is absolute black. To achieve proper contrast, you want your highest highlight to be at the top and your lowest shadow to be at the bottom. To manipulate the values on a waveform, what you want to do is you want to get some primary bars. The way you get to your primary bars is you go to your color wheels, go to the tab at the top right at the color wheels, and change it to primary bars. These give you an RGB representation of lift, gamma, gain, and offset. What you want to do is you want to get your highest highlight to the top at absolute white. So what you do is you go to the gain, which is basically the highlight, and you raise it by putting your mouse over it and scrolling upwards until you hit the line. Once you've hit that line, you've achieved absolute white. Then you want to go to lift, which are your shadows, and do the exact same thing. Once you've got that, you've basically got contrast. The last thing you want to do is go to gamma and sort of get your midpoints at the middle. This will get you proper contrast and will get you one step closer to being color corrected. You can again look at the difference by toggling the node on and off, and you can see how the shadows and the highlights look a lot crisper and nicer than they did before. Finally, we're at skin tones. So what you're going to want to do is create a new node and label it skin tones. Now, if you look at the model in the footage, you can see that his skin is a little bit pinkish and it's not representative of real life. So to change this, we're going to use a scope called the vector scope. Now, the vector scope is this scope here. And what you want to do when you first get into it is tick this box that says show skin tone indicator. This will help us match the skin tones to what skin should really be like. It's this little white line that goes through the scope. Basically, you want to match all of your color along this skin tone line so you have the correct skin tones. Now, it's not always accurate, but it is in most cases. So we're going to be trying to match the skin tone to the skin tone line to hopefully remove the pink. The vector scope is basically a black and white wireframe version of the color wheel. You can see the red, the blue, the green in little boxes on the vector scope. So how do we manipulate the vector scope? Well, the vector scope is a reading of hue and saturation. Changing the hue and the saturation changes the vector scope accordingly. So the hue changes which color values your footage has. So if I change the hue right now, you'll see how the footage light on the vector scope moves away from the skin tone. So what we want to do is we want to change the hue to make it line up with the line. Once you've lined up the light in the vector scope with the line, you should have balanced skin tones. Now, if we go back and we look and remove all of the filters at once, you can see the original image and what it looks like after color correction. You can see how much of a change color correction has actually made on the footage and how realistic it looks to the real world now. We're going to move on to styling. When you're styling, it's pretty much up to what you want to do. The most basic way to do it is to just use color wheels and control the colors to what you want to do and which mood you want to set in the scene. I'm not going to teach you that because that's pretty self-explanatory. I want to teach you quickly about LUTs. LUTs are basically preset color grades and they give you a film look, and if you apply the right adjustments to it, it can create a really nice looking shot. So to do this, you create two nodes, the first node being the adjustments and the second being the LUT. To get a LUT, you right click the node, go to 3D LUT, go to film looks, and then you pick one of the LUTs. You can see instantly what the LUT does and how it brings out the highlights and the shadows and the contrast to make it look pretty cool. But it's still not perfect. It looks oversaturated and the image doesn't look very good. So to adjust this and counteract the LUT, you go to the previous node which you set up, which is the adjustments node, and you bring up the shadows and you bring the highlights down, and you can start to see how this neutralizes the effect. That's it for this tutorial, but have a play with some of the things that I taught you within this lesson and try to create your own style and workflow from it, because color grading is really up to what you can see in the footage and what you want to portray. One thing I want to leave you with is color grading can never substitute for bad footage. If your footage is bad, color grading can never save it. So always make sure that your footage is good before you go into color grading, and never rely on color grading to make your footage good.